up to the cloud, and I'm going to share. So I think you should be able to hear it in a second, and you should be able to see it, and we'll be all good right now as we're sharing it up on live. So yeah, we have a little bit of rain out here today. We have, again, maybe a billionaire or two. I don't know. Got to do one more. Got one more time, Mike. You gotta, if you could get us going there. Excuse me. I don't know why I'm coughing right now. I'm not coughing. I'm breathing. Thank you, Mike. So, yeah, we were created to do this. And again, today we're continuing our study of an interesting time in the history of our people when there seems to be some definitely, there definitely seems to be some historical elements to this story that we're reading, very historical elements, but there's also a mythic element to what we're reading, and definitely a big lesson to what we're reading. Because the narrative really, as you're going to see today, focuses on the people, on the individuals, and on a bigger lesson here rather than history. So there is definitely some history, an interesting historical nuggets here. And we're going to be reading about the end of the Omri dynasty. So the end of the king Omri, Ahab, and then his sons and his wife, Jezebel. And this is the end of a dynasty. Now, it's not a very long reigning dynasty. It's, as dynasties go, maybe as long as the the New England Patriot dynasty, which lasted 20 years, or the Astro dynasty now that they're calling it, that lasted 6, or maybe the Laker dynasty back in the 80s that lasted about 10. But it's a dynasty because it passes from one generation to the other, but it really only goes 3 generations. But they're very powerful. Yeah, it's about 100 years, and it's also a powerful dynasty. And I think that's almost, it's not just the fact that a few people got to be king in that family, but that they actually had power, and that their power actually extends in ways that, like, we don't think about or we don't talk about, but you're going to learn it today. So again, Ahab is not considered a good king by any stretch of the imagination by the Bible. The prophets don't like him. Elijah doesn't like him, obviously. Elisha doesn't really interact with him fully, from what we can see, though he interacts with his kids, with Elisha's kids, and, as we're going to see today, with his wife, Jezebel, who's a widow, because Ahab died, and she's still very much in power. And so we're going to see how Elisha interacts with them a little bit, the family. We did last week. And it's not all bad. I mean, because we saw that at least for King Joram, the king of Israel, Ahab's good son, or better son, that, he seems to respect Elisha. He seems to respect the Jewish religion, or the Israelite religion, if you will, the Torah. But he's still not a good king by the biblical standards, and we'll see today what happens. So we do know that he goes to war. We saw him go to war against the Moabites in that crazy scene with Mesha, where he gets turned back, and we read that a couple of weeks ago. And then today, as we read last week, he's fighting with the Syrians, the Arameans, the people of Aram. And so he is... we're going to read about that today. So, so the last thing we read is that the Arameans attack, but they're foiled by a miracle. They actually get caught, and Elisha tells Joram, the Israelite king, "Don't kill them. They're your prisoners. You don't kill them." And so he takes them, and the king actually asks Elisha, what should I do? And he says it respectfully to him too, right? He says, my father Avi. He says, what should I do? Shall I strike them down? And he says, no, they're your captives. And so that last thing we read is that he has a meal for them, and then they stopped invading the land of Israel. That's the last thing we read. The first thing we read today is that they attacked Israel. And here again, they refer to it as Samaria, Shomron, which is the name for the capital city. So it's like saying Jerusalem. When you're talking about the Judahites, the kingdom in the south is sometimes just called Jerusalem, even though they're not attacking necessarily Jerusalem itself. But, it's like saying that you went to war against Baghdad if you're going to war against Iraq, and you're not really going to war against necessarily just Baghdad or even attack Baghdad. So this is where we're going to pick up King Ben-Hadad. And again, Hadad is the god of the Arameans. He's the powerful god. He's their equivalent of Baal. He's their equivalent of our Adonai. And so Ben-Hadad means literally the son of the god, which we don't usually, interestingly, in Hebrew, call our kings Ben Adonai. We don't. We didn't call ourselves the son of God, partly because we didn't believe that God had children. So it's one of the differences between Israelite kings and Israelites in general and the other countries around them. So, but Ben Chemosh or Ben Molech, those are names that people would have. Even using, well, not really Ben Baal, but people who came from Baal. But anyways, we didn't do that. So let us take a look at verse 24, which is where we're starting. Rosemary, if you'd like to start us. Rosemary? Oh, I thought Rosemary was there. She's not there. I thought Rosemary was on the line. I thought she said hello. She didn't. So I'm asking someone who's not even there. Judith, would you like to, as our not our extra reader, as our special designated reader today, would you like to read?
Sure.
From Ventura. By the way, is it raining in Ventura?
It was. I just was looking outside. We have a rainbow out my window.
That's nice. Oh, yeah. She said she didn't know there was class. It never went out, huh?
No, it never went out.
No, it did not go out.
That's not good. Let me just make sure. Let me just figure out why it didn't go out. All right. So continue on, Judith. Start. Thank you.
Which verse 24?
Yeah, sometime later.
Sometime later, King Ben-Hadad of Aram mustered his entire army and marched upon Samaria and besieged it. There was a great famine in Samaria, and the siege continued until a donkey's head sold for 80 shekels of silver and a quarter of a cob of dove's dung for 5 shekels.
Yeah, so let's just explain what happens. Clearly, this is inflation, but this is inflation not that didn't have to do with, well, it has to do with supply and demand. During the famine, prices of food go up, and the amount of money that people are paying for food is ridiculous. So nobody wants to eat a donkey's head. I want to make that clear. That's actually what you don't want to eat. But it was so hard to come by food that people were even eating donkey's heads. Don't worry, it gets worse. Now dove dung, you'd think that's pretty much the worst thing you could eat. Just so you know, that's not what it is. It is carob pods. So it apparently was a nickname for it. That's something that we would say now would be we understand that now to be a euphemism or a nickname for him, right? So it wasn't actually they were eating dove's dung, but that's more of a study of comparative linguistics that gave us that understanding. Mary, what does the King James say for dove's dung? Dove's dung. Yeah, it just says dove's dung without a note. So I don't know if
it's grosser if it's really dove's dung.
Yeah, Gloria, are you there with your Bible?
Gloria's not here.
Okay, so yeah, I'm not sure if they have a note, but this is an example of people looking at comparative linguistics and looking at what other people. Akkadian was the language of Akkad, of the Assyrians, has a word for carob that clearly is dove dung. Why? Because carob pods kind of look like poop. It's not wasn't a far stretch to say that they look like that. Mainly because it didn't make any sense that dove's dung was going for that much. And people did collect dove's dung for fertilizer. So it wasn't like they didn't use it for something. So it wasn't like completely crazy, but they didn't eat it. There was no food, there was no nutritional value to it. And it's not even nutritional value of saying, well, they ate something that was gross and disgusting, because we're getting there. We're not there yet. If you thought dove's dung was bad, and if you thought a donkey's head was not so nice either, it's going to get worse. Because here it gets worse.
Once, when the king of Israel was walking on the city wall, a woman cried out to him, "Help me, your majesty." "Don't ask me," he replied. "Let the Lord help you. Where could I get help for you? From the threshing floor or from the winepress?"
Okay, so, the king is out and about on the wall, right? Overlooking things and doing his, being seen by the populace, and the population is going, you got to do something, king, which again is pretty crazy to read on election day, but this is a popular, to some extent, the kings, have to respond to the popular call of the people, and she says, "I need help," and he says, "Well, what am I supposed to do? I don't have, we don't have any food. We have no food." Remember, this famine's been going on for a while. We've read about this famine. So this famine's been going on. It seems like there's, again, a holy purpose to this famine, and let's see what happens.
"But what troubles you?" the king asked her. The woman answered, "That woman said to me, 'Give up your son and we will eat him today, and tomorrow we'll eat my son.' So we cooked my son and we ate him. The next day I said to her, 'Give up your son and let's eat him.' But she hid her son."
That is not what he expected to hear, I don't think. That is one of the more horrific things that you'll hear in the Bible. It's not the only time you'll hear that in the Bible. Sometimes you'll also, in the book of Lamentations, we read about, thanks, Doreen, we read about people eating their children. It's about as bad as that. That's about as bad as humanity can sink. It's horrific. But again, it's not the only place in the Bible we read about this. We read about it during the Babylonian siege, which happens about 150 years later. We hear about the same kind of thing, that people are eating other people. This is horrific because, again, this woman not only had to eat her child, but she was told that, next day we're going to eat the other child, and now the woman is not doing her part. I mean, it's at every level, it's horrific. But, here she thinks that she's giving her child over for the common good. And then, I mean, it's just, on every level, it's horrific. what's interesting about it is it's kind of a play off the Solomon story of the babies. And again, it may or may not have been intentioned that way. Or again, it's just the most horrific scene you can possibly imagine of people saying, look, we're trying to take care of our community. We're trying to feed people who are starving to death. Look, there's a whole lot of midrash that we could write about this, which is, again, how we, in many ways, leverage the future for today, right? And so whether we do it politically or whether we do it with our economy or whether we do it with the environment or whether we do it with, the way we spend money personally on a personal level, not on a global level, not on a macro level of our country or the world, but on our own personal bank account. So there's definitely things to think about here, especially today. This is a horrific moment in history, and it's a horrific moment for this king, because how horrible is his reign if this is what people are dealing with? Now let's see his response.
When the king heard what the woman said, he rent his clothes, and as he walked along the wall, the people could see that he was wearing sackcloth underneath. He said, "Thus and more may God do to me if the head of Elisha's son," let me start again. "Thus and more may God do to me if the head of Elisha, son of Shaphat, remains on his shoulders today."
Yeah. And, essentially, he's not happy about this. He doesn't say, well, there's nothing I can do about it. He feels that this is punishment coming from God to some extent through Elisha. Now, is this justified? Maybe, because we know that Elijah did this. Elijah stopped up the heavens during his father Ahab's time, if you recall, and it wasn't until the Carmel showdown between the prophets of Baal and the prophets of God, of the prophet of God, that the rain started falling again. So Yoram knows that there's a divine purpose to this. He blames Elisha for it, and he threatens Elisha's life. Now, what's interesting is when he tears his clothes, they can see that he's wearing sackcloth underneath, which is almost as if to say they see that he's praying and that he is mourning and that he's not wearing royal garments as well. So there's almost an understanding like he knows that there's a problem here and that he's not oblivious to it and he's not uncaring about it. Now, you can make the argument there's like a Shakespearean tragedy here going because he's part of a family that's evil. But is he captured by that? Is he, what's the answer? Now, I will tell you, we're going to see the answer today, but keep in mind that, this was edited and transmitted and written by our ancestors in the South, the Southern Kingdom, the people who were not happy with the Northern Kingdom and who didn't want there to be a separate Northern Kingdom. So to some extent, what can this guy do? But he just threatened Elisha, which is not probably the right answer. It definitely doesn't work out well for him. But let's take a look why.
Now Elisha was sitting at home, and the elders were sitting with him. The king had sent ahead one of his men, but before the messenger arrived, Elisha said to the elders, Do you see that murderer has sent someone to cut off my head? Watch when the messenger comes and shut the door and hold the door fast against him. No doubt the sound of his master's footsteps will follow. While he was talking to them, the messenger came to him and said, this calamity is from God, is from the Lord. What more can I hope for from the Lord?
So Elisha, being a prophet, knows what's happening. And sending somebody to kill him was not the right answer. Because first of all, he's a prophet, so he knows what's going to happen. So he locks the door just in time. Very dramatic. The guy's knocking on the door, and Elisha's saying, look, this guy's here to kill me, right? So, you know, even though Yoram doesn't seem to be a bad guy, you know, definitely not like his father and his mother and some of the other people, he's still not a good guy. And his answer of trying to kill Elisha to end this famine is not a good answer. Let's see what happens in this scene.
And Elisha replied, hear the word of the Lord. Thus said the Lord, this time tomorrow, a seah of choice flour shall sell for a shekel at the gate of Samaria, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel.
So Elisha tells the people that are around him that there's going to be a miracle and it's going to be over. And again, he uses economic terms to explain it, which is that the cost of living is about to come down tremendously.
Can you do this nowadays?
Can he do this today? The price of gas is going to go down to $1.50 tomorrow. That's essentially what he's saying, right? He's saying that, it's literally this is a miracle on a miraculous level, because here, choice flour, which obviously is flour that comes from nicer grains like wheat, and maybe nicer types of grain. That's going to be a shekel per seah, which is like a pound or 2 pounds. But 2 seahs of barley, 2 seahs of barley will sell for a shekel. And again, because barley was a cheaper grain, it was not as considered as nice of a grain, as luxurious as a grain. It was. I know that seems strange for us because, we don't see barley bread, but partly it's because people don't like it as much, and it was considered to be a poor person's bread. Probably any kind of special bread today is going to be a little bit more expensive because you're paying for something that isn't produced a lot. But in these days, that's because, again, wheat flour, as you could see, would sell for roughly twice as much as barley flour. That's another way of looking at it. So Elisha is saying it's all going to be fixed tomorrow. Again, not a great place to put a break. This is the way where the Christian scholars put the break at chapter 7. This clearly is the continuation of the story. But it is what it is. That's...
It's a little more dramatic to break there.
Yeah, I guess. I would actually break here. I would actually, if you're going to break it for drama, if the episode is ending, that's where you end it. Because you're like, what? What's he talking about? What's going to happen? Because this begs the question of now what's going to happen. And so here we go. And there's the answer.
The aide on whose arm the king was leaning spoke up and said to the man of God, even if the Lord were to make windows in the sky, could this come to pass? And he retorted, you shall see it with your own eyes, but you shall not eat of it.
Okay, so could also end it there, which is you know, the answer from the authorities is essentially, what are you talking about? Even if it started raining tomorrow, that couldn't happen. So the guy's doubting him tremendously that such a thing can happen. And he says, no, you'll see it, you'll see it, but you won't eat of it, which is kind of a scary thing to say to the guy, right? He's telling him, you'll see it, but you won't be able, which is ominous. So here's the story. Now, let's read this story. And this story I will tell you later on is actually a story that we do read in the Bible. It's one of the few stories from the book of Kings that we do read. So let's take a look at this story. Judith, if you'd tell us the story of the lepers.
Which parsha is it connected to?
You're jumping ahead. Keep going.
There were 4 men, lepers, outside the gate. They said to one another, why should we sit here waiting for death? If we decide to go into the town, what with the famine in the town, we shall die there. And if we just sit here, still we die. Come, let us desert to the Aramean camp. If they let us live, we shall live. And if they put us to death, we shall but die.
So there's a bunch of lepers sitting on the outside of town. Why are they on the outside of town? Because they're lepers. They're unclean. And according to the Torah, they are not allowed to be in the town. So they're outside of town, which means that they're precariously close to the front lines of the other army that's laying siege to it. So to kind of keep your mind on what's going on, you got a king walking around the outside of the gate occasionally, on the top of the gate, so you can see what's going on outside. But here you've got lepers that are on the other side of the gate, which means they're going to be the first people to die. They are dead. And that's what they say. They say, we're going to die out here because there's a famine and we're the last people that are going to get food. If we go over to the Arameans, maybe they'll let us live. But what do we have to lose? If they kill us, we're going to die anyways. So let's go over to the other side. Now, this is, again, the definition of being caught between a rock and a hard place. These guys, these lepers, are not sitting well. And again, they're not lepers. They have skin disease, but they don't have leprosy, because we don't have leprosy yet in ancient Israel. And so here we read this story, and well, let's read what happens to the story.
They set out at twilight for the Aramean camp, but when they came to the edge of the Aramean camp, there was no one there. For the Lord had caused the Aramean camp to hear a sound of chariots, a sound of horses, the din of a huge army. They said to one another, the king of Israel must have hired the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Mitzrayim to attack us. And they fled headlong in the twilight, abandoning their tents and horses and asses, the entire camp just as it was, as they fled for their lives.
So these lepers walk into an empty camp. The Arameans are all gone. And the reason that they're all gone is that God caused them to be scared, to hear noises and to see.
They heard on Facebook that an army was coming.
Okay, so they said, well, maybe they saw videos. They saw propaganda videos that were created. Yeah, this is a miracle, right? God causes a miracle to destroy this army, or to get the army out, which is exactly what he had done before with the Arameans, which is rule them, so that the Israelites didn't even have to lose anybody, even one person, in this fight. And so what happened was they thought the Israelites, interestingly here, hired the Hittites or Egypt to fight for them, which is interesting because it tells you, of course, that could have happened. that that's plausible, that Israel could have turned to one of the more powerful nations that surrounded it and said, hey, look, we'll pay you off if you attack the Arameans and get rid of them. Because again, you have larger regional players like the Egyptians and Hittites, who are the modern day Turks. And then you have smaller regional players like Israel, Jordan, and Syria, which, wow, actually happens to be the case right now. Right now. Right now, such a thing could happen. Though we say there's a couple other regional players. Iran would definitely be a regional player. Why? Because these countries have 100 million plus people living in those countries. So when you have a country like Israel that has about 7.5, 8 million people living in it, and you have a country to the south of it in Egypt, which has, over 100 million, and you have a country up in Turkey, which has, I can't remember what Turkish population is right now, but Iran has over 100 million people. So these are countries that are substantially larger than them, more powerful than them. The interesting thing is that Israel today has a more powerful economy than some of these countries. Their equivalent GDP is higher in Israel, but
86 million.
86 million in Turkey. So it's almost 100 million. And Egypt has, tell me, how many does Egypt have? So Turkey has about 10 times more people than Israel. And Egypt has 107 million people in Egypt. Think about that. It's one of the fastest growing populations in the world. And Iran has over 100 million as well. So when we think about what happens with these regional players, Israel sometimes gets caught in the middle. Yes, as Judith says, 4 lepers walk into a camp. That's not the. But here's the punchline. Here's the punchline. Here's the punchline. So it actually calls them Vayavo HaMitzoraim, which is interesting because that's a little bit like the Mitzrayim. That's a little bit like Egyptian, but adding one letter, the Ayin, Mitzoraim. The Mitzoraim are they are the heroes of the story. The punchline is that they're actually the heroes of the tale. So let's see what happens when they come in.
When those lepers came to the edge of the camp, they went into one of the tents and ate and drank. Then they carried off silver and gold and clothing from there and buried it. They came back, went into another tent, and they carried off what was there and buried it. Then they said to one another, "We are not doing right. This is a day of good news, and we are keeping silent. If we wait until the light of morning, we shall incur guilt. Come, let us go and inform the king's palace."
So these guys, the punchline is that if they were the 4 lepers, or if they were the 4 Marx brothers, or whatever you want to see them as, they are having a great time for a while in the camp, eating and drinking and storing up a lot of gold and silver and hiding said silver and gold, knowing that they can always come back and maybe get some more stuff later. They say, you know what, this isn't right. This isn't right. We got to share the wealth. We got to let everybody know what's happening. And they say, we got to let people know. So what's so cool about this is you can see is that these people who are marginalized, who are the fringes of society, wind up being the heroes of the story. That's really important, that these people end up becoming heroes. Of course, teaching us a lesson of you never know who's going to be the hero.
They're good people.
Well, good people.
They went and called out to the gatekeepers of the city and told them, "We have been to the Aramean camp. There is not a soul there, nor any human sound, but the horses are tethered and the asses are tethered, and the tents are undisturbed." The gatekeepers called out, and the news was passed on into the king's palace. The king rose in the night and said to his courtiers, "I will tell you what the Arameans have done to us. They know that we are starving, so they have gone out of camp and hidden in the fields, thinking, When they come out of the town, we will take them alive and get into the town.
Yeah, so the king doesn't buy it because he knows that this is a strategy, that people do this. It's a battle tactic, right? It's a feigned retreat, an attack, where you only pretend to retreat. You lull the people out of the city and then you attack them when they come out. So this was, in his mind, it was a ploy. It was a trick. He doesn't buy it.
But one of the courtiers spoke up. Let a few of the remaining horses that are still here be taken. They are like those that are left here of the whole multitude of Israel, out of the whole multitude of Israel that have perished, and let us send and find out. They took 2 teams of horses, and the king sent them after the Aramean army, saying, go and find out.
Right. So they don't have a lot of horses left. They've eaten them. But they're going to say, let's go find out where these guys are.
They followed them as far as the Jordan and found the entire road full of clothing and gear, which the Arameans had thrown away in their haste. And the messengers returned and told the king.
So they see miles of material left behind, and so they say, no, this is not a joke. This is not a ploy. This is not a trick. This is for real. They've gone, and this is obviously really, really good news.
The people went out and plundered the Aramean camp. So a salve, choice flour sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel, as the Lord had spoken. So
exactly what Elisha said happens, which is that they now have all of this food, and they're like, that's the only way it could have happened, was it literally if an army had brought the food to them. And that's what happens. They literally get restocked in a miraculous way. But wait, we know something else is going to happen.
Now the king had put the aide on whose arm he leaned in charge of the gate, and he was trampled to death in the gate by the people, just as the man of God had spoken, as he had spoken when the king came down to him. For when the man of God said to the king, this time tomorrow, 2 seahs of barley shall sell at the gate of Samaria for a shekel, and a seah of choice flour for a shekel, the aide answered the man of God and said, even if the Lord made windows in the sky, could this come to pass? And he retorted, you shall see it with your own eyes, but you shall not eat of it.
That's the second part of the prophecy. That was the second part of the prophecy, right? The food is going to come, but you're not going to be able to eat of it. So how did Yoram die? He died in a mad trample, a stampede of people, which is weird. We just had one of those in Korea. 150 people died. It can happen. That's weird. It just happened. And it happens probably, at least once a year. There's some mass, concert or event where people get trampled to death. And it probably happened a lot in the ancient world before we knew about crowd flow and, how to manage exits and entrances, and people study this stuff now. And it still happens. So you can imagine how much it probably happened when people would get together in a place and some chaos would ensue, and it happened probably a lot. So this is not uncommon, maybe as uncommon as hopefully it will be today. But we study that kind of stuff. We study with computers, and we make models of how people, will get out of places in an emergency. But in this case too, you have a crazy thing here, which is there's a famine and people want that food, and they've been starving to the point that they're eating other people. There's one more line here.
This is exactly what happened to him. The people trampled him to death in the gate.
So that's crazy. The king died by being trampled to death.
Was it the king, or it sounds like it was the aide, though? I don't understand.
Yeah, the aide to the king. Yeah. So yeah, because he doubted it. Yeah, it was he doubted it. This is the Haftarah. It ends right here. It started when we started the story right here, the 4 lepers outside the gate, and it ends here in verse 20. So Judith already knew, and it's kind of as I said, we read this, and she knew that we read it at a Torah portion. So you know which Torah portion, Judith, too, we read this at, right? Hello?
Oh, which one?
The one that you said, when do we read this? You knew this was you knew that this was part of a special.
Yeah.
This is the Haftarah.
Yeah.
That we read when we read the Torah. So when we read, I'll just show you real quick. When we read in Leviticus, when we read in Vayikra, we get to these different Torah portions. So we have Tazria, which starts here in chapter 12 of Leviticus, which deals with keeping people who are bleeding outside of the community. And then it finishes with, well, it begins with that, I should say. Most of the portion from chapter 13 on, it starts talking about the Metzorah. It starts talking about the scaly skin disease, which again is not a leprosy, but as you notice here, it'll say, Sarat is used for a variety of diseases when a human being is declared impure. We use the traditional translation leprosy without regard to the modern medical terminology, which is another way of saying it's not leprosy. Everybody calls it leprosy. We're going to call it leprosy because everybody calls it leprosy. But it is a skin disease. This is Tzarat. So this is the first portion, Tazria, that has that. And the other Torah portion that has it is right here. The next part is Metzorah. So this is the next part, which is chapter 14. So 13, we read about this disease, and then it continues in 14, and then it goes all the way to, there's 15, pretty long chapter, 14, and goes through 15. And then in 16 is Achrei Mot. So the last words of this Torah portion, Metzorah, say, goes back to discharges and impurities and says, menstrual separation and emission of semen. Not necessarily the Torah portion you want to have for your bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah.
But so many do because of when we read it.
So many do, because it's usually in April. So Judith knows that as a tutor, as a teacher of Torah, that we oftentimes have these Torah portions. And again, some people have Achrei Mot, which is the next portion. But if you have Tazria Metzorah, Achrei Mot has lots of other things in it, which are read at Yom Kippur, actually. But Tazria Metzorah are oftentimes read as, by the way, I should want to stress, as a double portion, because the theme of it is the same, and it starts in chapter, the chapters are not that long. They are sometimes combined. And so Tazria Metzorah are sometimes read, many years are read as a double portion. So it starts right here, chapter 12. So chapter 12, 13, 14, 15 are sometimes read as one portion. So Tazria Metzorah are difficult portions to read because they talk about medical inspections, they talk about quarantining, and that's very annoying. So somebody's I don't know, somebody's car alarm went off. Yeah, it's election day, that's why. So Tazria Metzorah is All right, thanks. Tazria and Metzora are difficult portions to read. They're difficult portions to, especially as we said, if you have a bar bat mitzvah that week. But more importantly, we're sometimes left with this understanding that if we have these diseases, number one, we're cursed, we're taken out of the community because we don't, we have to live outside the camp while we're infected, so we're quarantined. And these are tough things to read. By the way, they were very tough to read when we were dealing with people living with and dying with AIDS on a massive scale, because it was difficult to read these portions without thinking about AIDS every year when we read these portions. During the 80s and 90s, up until early 2000s, every time we read these portions, we kind of thought about AIDS. It was almost impossible not to, especially in the early days of the AIDS crisis that we had in this country, where we talked about quarantining people. We talked about keeping people outside of the community as a possibility for how to stop the spread. The last couple of years, we couldn't read Tazria and Metzora without thinking about COVID, because we talked about the same kinds of issues of how do we quarantine people, how do we keep people safe, and how at the same time, how do we keep the community safe? So what do we do in order to be both compassionate in caring for people, but at the same time caring for society as a whole? So these were things that we thought about the last couple of years. Probably as the shadow of COVID still lingers on, even this year when we get to it in April time, Tazria Metzora will probably still, there'll still be a lot of sermons and bar and bat mitzvah speeches which refer back to COVID. I will tell you that that this year, Tazria and Metzora, I think, are read together. Let me just check. Tazria and Metzora are read this year. Tazria and Metzora will be read on April 22nd, Shabbat, April 22nd. So, and it's Tazria and Metzora together. And so we would we'd be reading all those chapters together. And as we said, we would be reading from these sections, and we have a different Haftarah that's read this year because it is a Rosh Chodesh. So as it turns out, we don't read either Haftarah, but we read a Haftarah for Rosh Chodesh from Isaiah. But Tazria Metzora, and getting back to Judith's point, when we read Tazria Metzora, we actually read, let me just see if we have this here. I'm not sure if we have, let me just see. If I go to Tazria, yeah, it doesn't have the Haftarot here. It doesn't have the Haftarot. It just has the portions that we read for each Aliyah. But what I was going to tell you is the Haftarot are very interesting for Tazria and Metzora. So for Tazria, for the first one, we read this section, which we just read last week. We read from right here, the story of Naaman. And if you remember the story of Naaman, what happens at the end of the story? In the last verses of this story, when we get to
Mark?
Yeah.
Metzora, you read 2 Kings 7:3-20.
Yeah. We're going to get to that in a second.
Yeah.
But this is Tazria. I'm showing you Tazria. We read the story of Gehazi, right? And so Gehazi gets struck with this disease because he lied and said, "You have to pay my boss," and then he gets hit. He gets hit with the he gets hit with the leprosy. It says right here at the end, Naaman's leprosy, Elisha tells him, will now be on you. Right? It ends there. That's a story about leprosy. A leprosy that gets, I'll say leprosy, the skin disease, whatever you want me to say. The skin disease that gets transferred from a good guy to a not so good guy. Interestingly, from a Gentile general, Naaman, to an Israelite prophet or prophet assistant, maybe a prophet disciple, if you will, who gets hit with the leprosy, gets hit with it. This story, as we just said, is the Haftarah for Metzorah. And so here we have a story that begins here in verse 3 of chapter 7 and goes all the way to the end of the chapter. And it's a story of lepers being a hero, of being heroes. These are the people who become the heroes of the story. So what's interesting about these Haftarot is that they take a Torah portion and Torah portions, which are, I wouldn't say they're cruel and heartless, but they're definitely much more antiseptic and sanitary and to some extent sanitized, right? To get to well, what does it really mean? How does it affect a person? It's not easy. Because if you think about the story that we just read, the lepers are literally saying to themselves, we're going to die one way or the other. And so that's a horrible thing to think about. And so the Haftarot actually remind us in a very powerful and beautiful way that there's a human dimension to this. There's a human dimension to illness. So it's as if you're sitting in medical school reading the book, and then you have to go out and actually treat people. And you have to go out to, the free clinic to help treat people. Because you're not going to see how the rich and powerful deal with disease, but you're going to see how the people who are on the fringes of society have to live and die with this disease. And you have to also, in this case, see that those people have the potential to be heroes, that they can be better than the people sitting in the palace, that those people that you look down upon, the people that you're scared of, the people that you're afraid to touch, could be the very people who rescue you. And so there's a very powerful lesson in the Haftarot there, and one that especially, again, during the AIDS epidemic, we really had to say to ourselves, remember, as much as we're trying to protect ourselves, as much as we're trying to figure out what is the best way to protect society, we have to remember humanity, and we have to remember that people in these situations are, in many cases, living without hope. And there's something very powerful about the decision that was made thousands of years ago for those Haftarot to be read at those Torah portions. So at the very time we finish those Torah portions, you open up the Haftarah and you have to read what it actually means. And to never stop having compassion for those people. So it's a very, very powerful lesson about life and death, about the rules that we create and what effect they have on anyone, everyone, especially the ones who are most vulnerable, especially the ones who are sitting outside the gate. So, and again, to take you back, it's hard to remember 40 years ago what it was like, but at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, people were scared to death. I was scared to death. We didn't know, and people were dying. And a horrific death. I mean, it was just terrible. And we didn't know. We didn't know, and there was no cure. And there was no, now we have treatments that really are almost miraculous, but it took a long time to get those cures. And a lot of people died, and a lot of people died alone. And a lot of people died because their families were afraid to visit them in the hospital. And a lot of people were not buried properly because people were afraid to bring them into their mortuaries. And this really happened. Mary, what was that? Families were not allowed to visit them. And Mary knows this because she did it. Mary, you remember that?
I was on the other end. I made claims for them, so I learned about this. It was horrible reading the nursing notes about these people.
I will tell you that it feels like it was a long time ago, and maybe in some ways it was, but there were definitely some reverberations and some memories during this COVID crisis for me as I visited people in the hospital and booted up, geared up and put on my mask.
They forced him to quit.
Yeah, and to leave basketball. But I remember my sister had a friend, her best friend back in the 80s, whose mother contracted AIDS through a blood transfusion. She was anemic and had a bad blood transfusion. She died many years ago. One of the first people I ever knew who died of AIDS was a Jewish, normal mother, I don't want to say your typical Jewish mom in her late 40s who died of AIDS, and was one of the first people that I ever knew who died of AIDS back when. Yeah, but yes, he died as a hemophiliac, and people who had blood transfusions. She had a blood transfusion, but I remember it was about 1982, 83, 84. My sister used to go over to her friend's house, and I told my mom, I said, I don't want her coming back in the house.
That was scary because we had a friend at work that contracted AIDS. He was gay.
But I didn't know. And I was like, my mom was telling me, well, how's she going to get it? And I said, I don't know. She's eating over at their house. She's eating in their house. And I said, she's going to take a spoon, or she's going to eat from. And I said, she could get it, Mom. I said, how are you letting her go over to her house? I'm telling you, I remember that vividly in my mind as a high school kid, whatever. And I'm telling you, fast forward, 10 years later, I was working in an AIDS day treatment program in Brooklyn, visiting people dying of TB and dying of who were dying alone because their families wouldn't visit them. But we knew more about it then. And to me, I know, but I know. But this was my penance, man. This was my haftarah for my own feelings of fear initially. I know, but I understand, but I know. Well, fortunately, my mother had more sense than I did and said that my sister should go visit her friend who probably had other friends who wouldn't let their kids go to their house. And my mother fortunately stepped in and said, this girl probably needs a friend more than ever while her mom is dying. And so I'm telling you, we were all, again, I was ignorant, but I was like everybody else. But there's, I did my penance for that to some extent because I knew where my mind was at that moment. And my mind at that moment, and I was a kid, but I don't know how different I would have been today, which was I got to protect myself. I got to protect my family. I don't want disease in my house. And I was, I know where my mind was in that moment. So, once we knew more and once I overcame my own fear, then I was able to do that. But I mean, I did a funeral once for a Russian woman who died of AIDS in Brooklyn, who had her own family wouldn't come to the service. There was me. I'll never forget it. It was at a funeral, a pauper's funeral cemetery in Staten Island. And I literally was there with the cemetery manager, African-American dude sitting there at a partly Jewish cemetery, a Jewish section in a cemetery in Staten Island. And I'm telling you, there was me, him, someone from social services, and my baby daughter Rachel, who was sitting in a car seat, one of those removable car seats, sitting on the hood of the car while I did this service, because nobody else could do this service. No one else was going to do this service. So that was 96, 97. It wasn't that 97, maybe 96. But I remember, I'll never forget it. So it wasn't that long ago. It was 25, 26 years ago, but it feels like a lifetime ago. And we were still scared to death, a lot of us, up through the 80s and 90s, of what this would be for us. And again, fortunately, you got a lot of people who made it through, but it devastated communities in this country. And it wasn't just the gay community. It devastated African American communities. It devastated communities or especially urban areas. It was just unbelievable. So knew what it was like to be outside the gate. Anyways, I was going to say on to a happier story, but it's not really going to get happier today. It's a rainy day. So let's continue. Judith.
Elisha had said to the woman whose son he revived, "Leave immediately with your family and go sojourn somewhere else. For the Lord has decreed a 7-year famine upon the land, and it has already begun."
Now, this is interesting because this has gone back in time. So we've just stepped back with a kind of another story of Elisha, but it now helped explain how or again, gives us some context for what we've been reading about for the last several pages, which is there's a famine that Elisha knows and is going to be a 7-year famine, and it's a punishment from God. And he tells that woman that we read about a couple of weeks ago, the one whose son he revived, you got to get out of here because there's going to be a famine, and it's not a short one. It's lasting for 7 years, and it's already underway. But you got to go. You got to get out of here.
The woman had done as the man of God had spoken. She left with her family and sojourned in the land of the Philistines for 7 years. At the end of the 7 years, the woman returned from the land of the Philistines and went to the king to complain about her house and farm.
So here's the interesting thing. This is now bringing us back up to the time we're in right now. The famine's over. So you could say, well, I don't like the way they told this story because the story should have been at the beginning. But if it had been at the beginning, then you would have known the famine ended. So they almost had to say the story the way it is here, which is, yeah, this was a 7-year famine. They could have made it a little clearer at the beginning that this was a 7-year famine, but they kind of hit you with this now. Oh yeah, that was a 7-year famine that we just went through. One ticket was sold in California, Mike.
Altadena.
I have not been to Altadena in the last couple of days. Could not have been me. Anyways, there's Mike. Mike gave us one year in California. But there's no winners anywhere else?
No.
Holy moly. Mike, why do you tell me that? Anyways, so 7 years are up. She comes back from the land of the Philistines nearby. She was living not far away, but she comes back into Israel, and she says, I don't like what's happening here.
Now the king was talking to Gehazi, the servant of the man of God, and he said, "Tell me all the wonderful things that Elisha has done." While he was telling the king how Elisha had revived a dead person, in came the woman whose son he had revived, complaining to the king about her house and farm. "My lord king," said Gehazi, "this is the woman, and this is her son whom Elisha revived."
Wow, that's crazy. That's a coincidence. No, I mean, literally, like Gehazi, first of all, Gehazi's hanging out with the king now. He's got a skin disease. And again, maybe it doesn't flare up all the time, right? Maybe it's like eczema, or maybe it's like something that gets bad at certain times, but he's got it. And by the way, it says his family has it too. But he's hanging out with the king now. But he's telling Elisha stories. He's telling Elisha, he wants to hear these stories of Elisha, which is interesting because it shows that the king is interested in Elisha. And, well, at least he's interested in Elisha. He does say he wants to kill him sometimes, but he likes the stories. He likes Elisha's stories. And so, Gehazi's telling him about how he revived a kid. And sure enough, as he's telling him that story, the woman walks in and she tells him, here you go.
The king questioned the woman, and she told him the story. So the king assigned a eunuch to her and instructed him, restore all her property and all the revenue from her farm from the time she left the country until now.
Well, that's nice. What a nice guy. He's restoring all the property that she would have lost, that she lost, and all the revenue that she would have lost during that time. So he seems like a nice guy. On the other hand, where the heck did this eunuch come from? What's he doing with eunuchs? That's the word that's used here, a saris. So let's just make sure that they use that translation for everybody. Use that translation. That's usually the translation we have for eunuch. So it seems like a good translation, but let's see if anybody said no. He's talking about, Barbanel is talking about the king. Let's just see if anybody else has. Let's see if Radak might have something. That's Rabbi Kimchi. Let's see if, yeah. He does talk about it. Yeah. So Radak, Rabbi Kimchi is saying, we don't allow eunuchs in Israel. So what's going on here? How did the king have a eunuch? Because we don't do that. Right? So what does it say? We took them from the Goyim. So he's a Gentile eunuch who's just in the employ.
So we don't necessarily create them, but we can have them.
We can hire them from overseas. He's an overseas eunuch. No, I mean, it's not a good thing. Because, of course, eunuchs have one main job. What's their main job, Judith?
Guarding the harem.
Taking care of the harem.
You're 100% correct. And here's what it says. They were standing before the women, as it says, guarded the women.
Guarded the women.
Shomer HaNashim. His job is to guard the women. So yeah, you could bring in a eunuch from other places. Yeah, but we didn't. Interestingly, again, this idea that we didn't do that is an important one. Interestingly enough, we actually, as I shared with you that story from the Christian Bible of that story of the eunuch, the Ethiopian eunuch in Philip, that there is a eunuch driving around on a day in Israel or in the area, and Philip goes and helps the guy understand the Bible, right? It does say he's an Ethiopian eunuch, which is interesting because it kind of buttresses the case that maybe these eunuchs were brought in from other countries. But yeah, the idea that the Torah forbids this, would lead us to say that if they ever did hire eunuchs or bring in eunuchs, that they maybe came from other places. Interestingly enough, being a eunuch was very important. It was an important job, and it was one that, in some cases, people willingly took on the responsibilities and the bodily disfigurement because it meant that they had tremendous power. Why would somebody do that? Why would somebody do that? Well, maybe because they wanted tremendous power and responsibility. Maybe also they weren't that interested in women. And making that trade-off was not for them necessarily as problematic, because they could then live a lifestyle, or nobody would expect them to be married anymore. And so they could have a lifestyle that allowed them to have tremendous power and control. And for those of you who remember the Game of Thrones, Varys was a eunuch. He actually carried his manhood around in a little bag with him. I remember that episode. But it was interesting because it kind of it brought to life the actual consequences of being a eunuch. He didn't choose to be a eunuch, but he definitely used the power. It's kind of a biblical thing. We read a lot about eunuchs in the book of Esther. The book of Esther is chock full of eunuchs. Yeah, a lot of eunuchs. So clearly this guy is pretty powerful, because the king tells the eunuch to go take care of business, make sure she gets her stuff back. That's kind of a nice story, but what happens with the scene as it plays out?
Elisha arrived in Damascus at a time when King Ben-Hadad of Aram was ill. The king was told, "The man of God is on his way here." And he said to Hazael, "Take a gift with you and go meet the man of God, and through him inquire of the Lord. Will I recover from this illness?"
Interestingly. So Elisha is hanging out in Damascus, and Ben-Hadad respects him, knows about him, wants to get some information from him. Interestingly, he's sick, which we didn't know about. But again, maybe he got sick from when he came into Israel the last time. He said he wasn't going to come in and invade anymore, and he's still invading. So maybe he got sick then. But here's what happens.
Hazael went to meet him, taking with him as a gift 40 camel loads of all the bounty of Damascus. He came and stood before him and said, "Your son, King Ben-Hadad of Aram, has sent me to you to ask, will I recover from this illness?" Elisha said to him, "Go and say to him, you will recover. However, the Lord has revealed to me that he will die."
What?
So Elisha has a really great way of delivering the message, which is kind of succinct to the point. Yeah, go back and tell him he's going to be okay. He's not going to be okay. And by the way, he's not going to be okay. But he has a reason for this. We already know this, which is that we read earlier that this guy Hazael is going to be king. So this is, Ben-Hadad is out. Hazael's coming in. And we read this. This was one of the first things that Elisha was supposed to do when he took over from Elijah, which is tell Jehu he's going to be king, tell Hazael he's going to be king. These are things you got to do. He's going to do both of them. We're going to see how both of them play out now. But Hazael is now being basically told the time is now. Yeah, this is a new dynasty of Aram, which, by the way, is being helped, if you will, by Elisha. Right. Elisha is an Israelite prophet, but he's actually behind the scenes helping to control this new dynasty in Aram.
The man of God kept his face expressionless for a long time, and then he wept. "Why does my Lord weep?" said Hazael. "Because I know," he replied, "what harm you will do to the Israelite people, and you will set their fortresses on fire, put their young men to the sword, dash their little ones in pieces, and rip open their pregnant women."
Wow. Now that's a pretty heavy-duty scene, because Elisha doesn't say anything to him really other than, give him the message, and doesn't, according to this, again, the translation we have here is, if you look at it, it says meaning of Hebrew uncertain, but the translation is vaya'am, made at panav. His face stood. And they translate it as expressionless. What does the King James say for verse 11? He settled his countenance steadfastly. Yeah. And then Adbosh is with some type of embarrassment. But then it says clearly, and then he wept. Vayavech ish ha-Elohim. And then the man of God, Elisha, then cried. But basically, something with his face was expressionless. He just stared at him, and then he started crying, which is a weird thing to do because Hazael just heard some really, really good news, right? And Hazael says, "Why are you crying?" And he says, "Because I know what you're going to do to my people." So as much as I'm the bearer of this good news to you, it's not good news to my people. I know what damage you're going to do to Israel when you become king. That, and the way he describes it too, so difficult to hear.
But how, asked Hazael, can your servant, who is a mere dog, perform such a mighty deed? Elisha replied, the Lord has shown me a vision of you as king of Aram.
Yeah. So he says to him, I know it. I've seen it. So Hazael says, I can't do this. And he says to him, no, I've seen it. I know it's going to happen. Now, it's a very powerful scene because, and again, if you were going to end the episode there, that's where I'd end it, where he basically says to him, no, you're going to do it. And notice that Hazael never says, I won't do that, I promise. When I'm king, I'll be a good king to Israel. I won't attack you guys. I will leave you alone. He doesn't say that. Right? He doesn't say, well, now that you've told me that, I won't do it. He doesn't say that.
He left Elisha and returned to his master, who asked him, what did Elisha say to you? He replied, he told me that you would recover. The next day, Hazael took a piece of netting, dipped it in water, and spread it over his face. So Ben-Hadad died, and Hazael succeeded him as king. So
not only did Ben-Hadad did not recover, he got help to not recover. pretty good way of making sure that the prophecy comes to pass, which is he's smothered to death. He did it in a pretty clever way, it seems like, right? It seems like, again, this is the translation we have of this, uncertain translation, but he basically did putting the pillow over the guy's face. He did something to him so that he couldn't breathe anymore. Smothered him to death. And Hazael becomes king because he killed the king. So he definitely didn't recover. That's a good way of making sure he didn't recover. Elisha didn't actually say to him, kill him, but he maybe put it in his mind. I don't know what you want to say, but Hazael is now king.
Obviously, his kids had no power either.
Yes.
In the 5th year of King Joram, son of Ahab of Israel, Jehoshaphat had been king of Judah. Joram, son of King Jehoshaphat of Judah, became king. He was 32 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 8 years.
Yeah, so let's just show real quickly what's happening here again. You have the You have King Jehoram, son of Ahab, and now you have King Jehoram, the son of Jehoshaphat, that are kings. So again, this is about 850. This is in this period from 850, 848 to 841. And this is where we're reading about it right now in Kings. Right here, sorry. This is Elisha, who's the prophet now at this point. We're not sure who the prophet in Judah is, but maybe Obadiah, maybe, question mark. We're just reading it right now. Yeah. Over a lot of kings. Not necessarily a long time, but I mean, 30 years, but
To me, that's a long time.
it's a long time for a lot of kings that he reigns over, that he serves. But Yehu is here. Here's Joram. You can see we're in this period right here. You can see that Yehu is about to take over. Joram here is taken over and reigns around the same time as this Joram. Though this Joram starts a little bit before. He starts 4 years before. So we're right about here. Or here, whatever. Right in this period from 850 to 841. When they overlap, there's two King Yorams, Joram and Joram. It's only written differently here, but it's not always written differently in the Bible. Sometimes it's written with a hey. Here it's written Yehoram, and here's Joram. But sometimes it's written with a hey there too. It means the same thing. God will be raised. So going back to Judah, to Jerusalem. But here's an interesting thing about it when it says he was there.
He followed the practices of the kings of Israel, whatever the house of Ahab did, for he had married a daughter of Ahab, and he did what was displeasing to the Lord.
Okay. Whoa. Let's just focus on that for one quick second. That means that this Joram and this Joram are related by marriage. Joram's sister, Jezebel, and Ahab's daughter is married to this dude right here. And what we know already, because they just told us, that's a bad seed. That is not a good guy. Joram is not a good guy, and he's married to a woman who's not good. Guess what? We shall read about her. She's right here. She's right here. Evil means she started out evil and she ends evil. Ahaziah, her son, evil ends evil. Joram, evil. Now, Jehoshaphat was considered good and Asa was considered good, but not these guys. Interestingly here, Yehu, who we're about to read, is good, but ends up evil. And as you can see, none of these guys up here in Israel are ever good, except for Yehu for a little bit. I would argue that Jeroboam started out good and becomes evil, in the sense that he was chosen to be king by the prophets, in this case, prophet Achiah. Yehu was chosen by Elisha. When they're chosen, they must have been okay. But to some extent, every one of these kings of Israel is going to be bad in the eyes of these people, who are the people who wrote and edited the Bible that we have currently. So we don't know how exactly evil they were. Seems to me that Joram is at least partly good. Not great, but he's not bad. The Bible even kind of says he's kind of good, but not Jehoram's, not Joram and not his family. immediate family. Because it says right there, he followed the practices of the kings of Israel. Whatever the house of Ahab did, he went along with it. So it seems as though, again, he's under their influence, which tells us, by the way, of how powerful Israel kingdom was. And when we see the fact that Israel goes and Israel brings Judah into battle with them in that story of Mesha, oh, wait, now it all makes sense. Jehoshaphat was the king then, but his son was married. Maybe, again, Joram was already married to Athaliah. So there's very close connections. And so much so that if you think about it, we just gave it away. Ahab got a little bit of blood in the kings of Judah from now on. He didn't go away. We don't think about that. We don't talk about that. We forget that Ahab doesn't really ever go away because his daughter married one of the kings of Judah. And here's what it says about those bad Judah kings.
However, the Lord refrained from destroying Judah for the sake of his servant David, in accordance with his promise to maintain a lamp for his descendants for all time. During his reign, the Edomites rebelled against Judah's rule and set up a king of their own.
Interesting. So we read about how the Edomites were in battle with them under Jehoshaphat's time when they went to battle against Mesha. But now the Edomites have decided, we don't need to be under your power, which probably indicates that they weren't as powerful anymore. How do we know? Because they rebelled. And generally you rebel when you see a vacuum, when you see an opportunity to take power. Edom rebels. So again, if you just take a quick look at the map. Whoa. So here you have Judah, and here's Israel in the north. Here's the Ammonites, the Moabites, who are under Israelite control for most of the time. Edom is under Judahite control, but then they rebel. What do you think of that? It means that the kingdoms were not as powerful. And here's what it says.
Joram crossed over to Zair with all his chariotry. He arose by night and attacked the Edomites, who were surrounding him and the chariots' commanders, but his troops fled to their homes. Thus Edom fell away from Judah, as it still is the case. Libnah likewise fell away at that time.
So that's a pretty good indication that Judah is not very powerful right now. Edom revolts. Joram decides to go back over the Jordan River across the Jordan Valley to attack them and to try to bring them back into the fold. And what happened? His army said, no, it's okay. We're not interested.
We're not interested.
This is not a good thing. If you're a king and your army won't fight for you, it's a pretty good indication that you don't have a lot of power. This is not good. By the way, critical, not good, but critical. Why? Why am I telling you this? Because this might be an indication of when this was written, or at least not when this was written. I don't know when this was written, but let's take a quick look at when something else was written. Let's go back into the Bible. Let's go back into the Bible and let's read, right above here, where Esau and Jacob are getting blessed, right? And Esau is so upset after Jacob gets blessed. He says, Dad, what about me? Don't you have a blessing for me? And he cries and he says, and Esau, cries, and Isaac gives him a blessing. He says, your abode shall enjoy the fat of the earth and the dew above, and yet by your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother, and when you grow restive, you shall break his yoke from your neck. Which means the Bible might have just tipped its hand of when this was actually written. Because either it's a prophecy, which could have been, for some date very far in the future, or it could tell us that just now, we just learned when this verse this verse was written. Or actually, this verse was just written, which is that Edom is no longer under Judah's control. So the Bible told us in Genesis that such a day like this would come. Such a day like this has now come. And the Edomites are now free of Judah's control, just as Isaac told Esau many, many years ago. Again, it could also be an indication of when this was written, after 850. It's a possibility. But these little clues here are helpful to us and are sometimes, again, it could be a prophecy. It could have been a prophecy. But the fact that the person who wrote it knew that this had happened is also a possibility. So, this is a critical moment in the history of the Judean people. Edom would eventually come under our control again, but hundreds and hundreds of years later, about 600 years later, during the time of the Maccabees. One of the Maccabean kings, John Hyrcanus, conquered Idumea and made it part of his kingdom, and forcibly converted the Idumeans to Judaism. And that was the end of the Idumeans as a separate people. It was not the end of the Idumeans because King Herod was one of those people. His grandfather was forcibly converted. And of course, King Herod turns out to be a Jewish king who builds the temple, but also helps destroy us by killing the rest of the Maccabean family and essentially installing his own inept children who become puppets of the Romans and blah, 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 the end of Jewish sovereignty for the last 2,000 years. So the Idumeans may have had the last laugh unintentionally. But this was all history, folks, and it actually happened. So you want to say, well, it's in the Bible, it's prophecy, it's this or that. It actually happened. The Idumeans actually end up, ironically, helping, if not end the Jewish sovereignty, helping accelerate it, helping to make it come to pass. Would it have happened anyways? Maybe. Maybe it would have happened even earlier. Maybe King Herod kept the Jewish sovereignty alive for a few extra years because he knew how to deal with the Romans. Those are all possibilities. But it's also a possibility that the last Jewish ruler who had any power at all was actually an Idumean. Interesting. King Yoram. What else do we know about King Yoram? Not a whole lot, folks, because
he's not there very long. The other events of Yoram's reign and all his actions are recorded in the annals of the kings of Judah, which we don't have.
Yep.
Yoram slept with his fathers and was buried with his fathers in the city of David. His son Ahaziah succeeded him as king.
Yeah. So as you saw, he was king for like 7 years. Not a long time. It doesn't say a lot about him. The Bible says if you want to read more, go read that other book that we don't have. We don't have a lot, and he probably didn't do a lot in 7 years, though the Bible does tell us anything he did was useless because all he did was the stupid things that the Omrid dynasty under Ahab did. So he was not a good king, and he dies, and his son Ahaziah takes over, which means that Ahaziah is also part of the Omrid dynasty, at least bloodline. He's carrying around his grandfather's blood in him. Let's see if Ahaziah, well, you already know Ahaziah is not a good king, but anyways, here's what it says.
In the 12th year of King Yoram, son of Ahab of Israel, Ahaziah, son of Joram, became king of Judah. Ahaziah was 22 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 1 year. His mother's name was Atalia, daughter of King Omri of Israel.
Yeah. Now, it says daughter of King Omri. She's not the daughter of King Omri. She's the daughter of Ahab. Her grandfather was Omri, but she's the daughter of Omri, like Ahaziah is the son of David. They're part of the dynasty. So I would say, instead of daughter, I would say, what does the King James say? Does it say daughter? Yeah, it says Bat Omri, but we would say daughter of the house of Omri. That would be a better way of at least indicating to you that she's not literally the daughter of Omri. She's the granddaughter, but she's from that house, which of course means that her mother is Jezebel. Guess what? She's a lot like mommy. And she has a lot of the worst qualities of her mother. Namely, she's not interested in Israelite religion, which number one makes her really problematic. Number two, she seems to be as craven and greedy and power hungry as her mom, and maybe even more so, as you'll see. So this Queen Atalia, or in Hebrew, Atalyahu, she has God's name in her name, by the way. Atalyahu is God's name. She is now the queen mother. Now, by the way, lest you think that her kid is very young, the Bible just told you he's 22. So he's not a kid. He's a young man, but he's not 15. He's not 9. I mean, King Tut was 9 when he became king. You could argue that he didn't really have a lot of say over what he did. This is a 22-year-old. He's a very, very young 22, if we'll say. Maybe, again, whether he's mature enough or not, his mom, as we're going to see, is the one in power. So it's a very interesting story. It's one that a lot of people don't know. It's not talked about a lot in the rabbinic tradition, probably because it's so problematic and it's so weird that they didn't really deal with it a lot. There's not a lot of midrash about her, unfortunately. There's not a lot of imagination or commentary about her. She's not really written about. And again, partly because she's not a good person, but I do think that there's something very interesting here about a woman who essentially becomes powerful and comes from the other side, comes from Israel, comes from the other kingdom. You know a little something's wrong, because he's 22 years old when he becomes king, and it says right away he ruled for 1 year. He's a 22-year-old, which, by the way, also tells us that he's alive and his mom's alive during the campaign of his grandfather Josaphat, because his father was only king for 7 years, which means he was a young man. He was a teenager when Mesha's revolt happened. So all this stuff is happening around this time, around 850. So this is all happening within a few years. People saw this go down in a very short period of time. So here's what happens. You already know he only is going to last for 1 year, but let's read what happens.
He walked in the ways of the house of Ahab and did what was displeasing to the Lord, like the house of Ahab, for he was related by marriage to the house of Ahab. He marched with Joram, son of Ahab, to battle against King Hazael of Aram at Ramoth Gilead, but the Arameans wounded Joram. King Joram retired to Jezreel to recover from the wounds which the Arameans had inflicted upon him at Ramah, when he fought against King Hazael of Aram. And King Ahaziah, son of Joram of Judah, went down to Jezreel to visit Joram, son of Ahab, while he was ill.
So again, this is the other King Joram. This was the king of of Israel, essentially his uncle, right? And they're telling you, look, we know this is confusing. We know that King Ahaziah's father's name is Yoram, and here again you can see they're using both Yorams without the Hayes, right? So you don't see Yehoram; it's both Yoram, same guy. Don't worry, same guys. But so he hangs out with his uncle. He's with his uncle, King Ahaziah. And that's where that chapter ends. It's not a great break, but let's read a little, because we're going to read a little bit more.
Then the prophet Elisha summoned one of the disciples of the prophets and said to him, tie up your skirts, take along this flask of oil, and go to Ramoth Gilead. When you arrive there, go and see Jehu, son of Jehoshaphat of Nimshi. Get him to leave his comrades and take him into an inner room. Then take the flask of oil and pour some on his head and say, thus said the Lord, I anoint you king over Israel. Then open the door and flee without delay.
Yeah, so Elisha knows that they're going to make Jehu king. Jehu is going to be king of the north of Israel. Not of Judah, of Israel, right? We're not going to have any usurpers in Judah. It's all Judah's family, all Judahites, all David's family, all from that line. But in the north, we're going to have, as you kind of already saw, I showed you the list of kings. You're going to have a new, this new dynasty take over. Yehu's going to take power. He is a captain. He's a soldier, and he is going to be anointed by one of Elisha's disciples, according to this.
The young man, the servant of the prophet, went to Ramoth Gilead. When he arrived, the army commanders were sitting together. He said, Commander, I have a message for you. For which one of us? Jehu asked. He answered, for you, Commander. So Jehu arose and went inside, and the disciple poured the oil on his head and said to him, thus said the Lord, the God of Israel, I anoint you king over the people of the Lord, over Israel.
Wow, you're king. And here's what he says.
You shall strike down the house of Ahab, your master. Thus will I avenge on Jezebel the blood of my servants, the prophets, and the blood of the other servants of the Lord. The whole house of Ahab shall perish, and I will cut off every male belonging to Ahab, bond and free, in Israel. I will make the house of Ahab like the house of Jeroboam, son of Nevat, and like the house of Baasha, son of Ahiah. The dogs shall devour Jezebel in the field of Jezreel, with none to bury her. Then he opened the door and fled.
Wow, that's pretty dramatic. You're going to be king, and I'm bringing an end to the whole house of Ahab. They're all going to die, and Jezebel's going to get eaten by dogs. Wow, and then he runs out. Woof. Yehu's just had a strange visit. And by the way, it's not just that I'm going to make you king, but you will strike down the house of Ahab, your master. So you're going to have to kill this guy. So this is a pretty heavy thing to lay on this guy, on Jehu. What's he going to do? We'll read a little bit more.
Jehu went out to the other officers of his master, and they asked him, is all well? What did that madman come to you for? He said to them, you know the man and his ranting. You're lying, they said. Tell us the truth. Then he replied, thus and thus he said, thus said the Lord, I anoint you king over Israel.
Yeah, so they say, come on, what did he really say? He goes, yeah, the guy's crazy. He goes, no, what did the guy, come on, tell us, what did he say? And he told them. He told them, and he said, got to the point. which is that he said, I'm going to be king.
Quickly, each man took his cloak and placed it under him on the top step. They sounded the horn and proclaimed, Yehu is king. Thus Yephat she conspired against Yoram. Yoram and all Israel had been defending Ramoth Gilead against King Hazael of Aram. But King Yoram had gone back to Jezreel to recover from the wounds which in his battle with King Hazael of Aram. Yehu said, if such is your wish, allow no one to slip out of court this day. Then Yehu mounted his chariot and drove to Jezreel, for Yoram was lying ill there, and King Ahaziah of Judah had gone down to visit Yoram. The lookout was stationed on the tower of Jezreel, and he saw the troop of Yehu as he approached. He called out, I see a troop. Yoram said, dispatch a horseman to meet them and let him ask, is all well? The horseman went to meet him, and he said, the king inquires, is all well? Yehu replied, what concern of yours is it, whether all is well? Fall in behind me. The lookout reported, the messenger has reached them, but has not turned back.
So again, as they're coming to see Yoram, as Yehu and his group are coming to meet Yoram, they send out a messenger asking what's going on. And the messenger comes to him and says, is everything okay? And he goes, don't worry about it. Get in behind me. That's a pretty dramatic scene, because now they're looking at him from the wall of Jezreel, the fortress. And they ask the lookout, what happened? He says, I don't know. The messenger he came in behind him. He didn't come back, tell him what's going on. He just got in behind him. They're still coming.
The horseman went to meet him.
Well, hold on a second.
Yep.
Saw that part.
Yep.
So he sent out
a second horseman. He came to them and said, thus says the king, is all well? Yehu answered, what concern of yours is it, whether all is well? Fall in behind me. And the lookout reported, the messenger has reached them, but has not turned back. And Yehu arrives wildly.
Yeah, we lost you for saying this. The connection wasn't good. Yeah. So anyways, if you're following along, messenger number 2 is now gotten behind, and now they're saying it looks like he's going pretty fast.
Yoram ordered, hitch up the chariot. Yoram of Israel and King Ahaziah of Judah went out, each in his own chariot, to meet Yehu. They met him at the field of Navoth, the Jezreelite. When is all well, Yehu? But Yehu replied, how can all be well as long as your mother Jezebel carries on her countless harlotries and sorceries?
Wow. So Yehu says to him, so he says to Yehu, is everything okay? And Yehu's answer is, how can it be when your mother Jezebel is continuing on all these horrible things that she's doing, which include sorcery, lots of sorcery, it says, countless sorcery, and also her harlotry. And that's the word that's used here. Znuni. That's prostitution. That's prostitution. That's sexual. So it's not just magic, it's also sexual stuff. And he's saying it can't be good with your mom in charge. So he doesn't really say it's you, it says it's your mom. What of course is so ironic is it's happening right in the field of Navot, the very field that got stolen by Jezebel and Ahab. Bum, bum, bum. This is where, if there's ever any place for justice to happen, it's right here in this very field that got stolen. This beautiful field that was the field of Navot.
Thereupon Yoram turned his horses around and fled, crying out to Ahaziah, "Treason, Ahaziah!" But Yehu drew his bow and hit Yoram between the shoulders, so that the arrow pierced his heart, and he collapsed in his chariot.
Wow. That's pretty scary. That is pretty scary. So Yoram gets hit. He knows what's going to happen, and Yehu kills him, or strikes him.
Yehu thereupon ordered his officer Bidkar, pick him up and throw him into the field of Naboth the Jezreelite. Remember how you and I were riding side by side behind his father Ahab when the Lord made this pronouncement upon him. I swear I have taken none of the blood of Naboth and the blood of his sons yesterday, declares the Lord. And I will requite you in this plot, declares the Lord. So pick him up and throw him unto the plot in accordance with the word of the Lord.
Wow. Remember, this is the plot. This is where this all went down. This plot, this land of Naboth. And here's what happens.
On seeing this, King Ahaziah of Judah fled along the road to Beit Hagan. Yehu pursued him and said, "Shoot him down too." And they shot him in his chariot at the ascent of Gur, which is near Ivleam. He fled to Megiddo and died there. His servants conveyed him in a chariot to Jerusalem, and they buried him in his grave with his fathers in the city of David.
Wow. So this act of treason of Yehu's was crazy, because not only did he kill Yoram, he just killed the king of Judah, Ahaziah. That's why he only reigned for 1 year. That's how it went down. He got killed. He got killed because he's part of this family. He got killed because he's no better than the rest of these guys. He's hanging out here with his uncle, and he just got killed there with his uncle. And he gets brought back to Judah to be buried. This story's crazy.
Ahaziah had become king over Judah in the 11th year of Yoram, son of Ahab. Yehu went to Jezreel. When Jezebel heard of it, she painted her eyes with kohl and dressed her hair, and she looked out of the window. As Yehu entered the gate, she called out, "Is all well, Zimri, murderer of your master?"
So Yehu goes back to where Jezebel is, back into the fortress. Jezebel paints her eyes, gets all dressed up, and she looks out the window. And what does Yehu say to her? "How are you doing, Zimri, murderer of your master?" Because remember, Zimri was the one who killed the king, Elah, Baasha's son. He makes himself king, and he's only king for a week before Omri kills him and takes over. So he calls her Zimri, which is basically saying you're a traitorous backstabber. She doesn't even, he doesn't call her by name. He calls her by this name. You're a backstabber.
He looked up toward the window and said, "Who is on my side? Who?" And 2 or 3 eunuchs leaned out toward him. "Throw her down," he said. They threw her down, and her blood spattered on the wall and on the horses, and they trampled her.
If that ain't Game of Thrones, I don't know what is. That is the end of Jezebel. Holy moly. The whole scene is laid out there with you, with her going up, putting on her makeup and her getting her hair ready. Look, this is not a young woman by this point, but she's still a vain woman. She's still what you want to say in your mind. Imagine this woman for a moment getting up, knowing that this is probably her last moment on earth, and she's still being a queen. And his answer, Yehu is like, "I'm not even going to come up there. I'm not even going to come up there to kill him. Throw her out." And they did. And that, you read the last part.
Then he went inside and ate and drank. And he said, attend to that cursed woman and bury her, for she was a king's daughter.
I would say it like this, for she was a king's daughter. He said, yeah, I guess we got to. She is royalty. By the way, not her husband, not that saying that she was a queen, but that her father, the king of the Phoenicians, was a king, which is crazy because they don't even recognize her as their queen. Yeah, she's a whatever, but she was a princess. She was a queen's daughter. And here's what happened.
So they went to bury her, but all they found of her were the skull, the feet, and the hands. They came back and reported to him, and he said, it is just as the Lord spoke through his servant Elijah the Tishbite. The dog shall devour the flesh of Jezebel in the field of Jezreel. And the carcass of Jezebel shall be like dung on the ground in the field of Jezreel, so that none will be able to say, this was Jezebel.
Holy moly. That is a Bible story, folks, and that's why people don't write or talk about it, because that is a story that literally comes out of like the worst imagination of horror writers and the worst imagination of somebody who's going to have to talk and create a story of kingdoms and people who kill one person and have to take over by killing somebody else. This is the end of chapter 9. When we come back next week, we'll be reading about what happens now, because the queen is dead, but long live the queen. Because guess what? We're going to read about her horrible, horrible daughter, who is Queen Athaliah. So interestingly, and again, maybe one of the reasons why it wasn't discussed is that we go from one very powerful woman, queen, who does horrible things, to another. So she's the queen in Israel, exactly, Jezebel, and her daughter is the queen of Judah. So the legacy continues, and not in a good way. Well, thank you very much, and that's why I wanted to we read a little bit longer, but I wanted to get to the very important story of the end of Queen Jezebel, who ends in a horrible, horrible way. But we will be reading about Queen Athaliah. We're going to read a little bit more about Yehu in the north, but we're also then going to go back to the south and read about Queen Athaliah and what happens there with the Queen of the South. I don't even know what to say. If you thought Jezebel was bad,
it's like sing a song in the French Revolution. You got one king, but the next king.
Yeah, I'm only going to show you one thing, so you can come back next week and know what we're in for. When Athaliah, mother of Ahaziah, you have to watch. When Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, learned that her son was dead, she probably killed off everybody else. Holy moly. That means all the rest of the family, any of the cousins, any of the people who could have been king from the line of King David. That is nuts. That happened, and most likely really happened. That's not an imagination. We have history from this period. They knew the history. That's the history, folks. This woman went on a killing rampage and killed lots of guys from the house of Judah. Basically everybody, except for one. But you'll have to come back next week to hear. We'll see you, everybody. Thank you, Judith, for reading.
Thank you,
and thank you, Rosemary. Rosemary got to be in the background and got to be a participant today. But we thank you every week for reading too, Rosemary. Thank you, everybody. Stay dry, stay healthy, and vote.
Yes, vote.